Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for being here with us today to review some important insights and analysis from Budget 2025 in Alberta. We're really excited to be here to discuss this with you. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Melissa Caouette. I'm the founder of Pocket Lobbyist, and we are a subscription-based online tool for individuals who need to anticipate, interpret, and mitigate political risk in Alberta and across Canada. We have a membership that offers briefing notes, resources, and much more so that you can understand political risk, as well as a free newsletter. We're super active on social media, and we also have an amazing professional development offering called GR 101, which we'll get into in a little bit later. So part of what we do here at Pocket Lobbyist is make budgets and everything that surrounds budgets easier to digest for people. I think financial literacy in our personal lives, but as well as in government and politics, is super important, especially when there's so much happening and changing and going on. So without further ado, let's just jump right into it. So as many of you would have seen, we are not going to get into a line by line review of everything that's happened in budget. Budget was tabled last Thursday, February 27th, and by now it's March 7th. You'll have had a chance to go through each of the individual line items that impact you and your organization. We're always available to answer questions on those if you have them, but today's discussion is really going to focus on this sort of sentiment and approach with how one should look at budget, as well as looking at some of those top line numbers into what is new and notable out of budget, and then just tying it together with what it all means and what you can do to continue to stay informed. So let's dive right in. So before we get into talking specifically about Budget 2025, I really just want to spend a couple of moments to talk about some of what you should know to understand budgets. I like to start from the basics because I think that you look at budgets through a completely different lens than you would if you don't have this information. And government budgets are quite different than personal budgets. And so the lens through which we look at them needs to also be different. So when we look at budgets, we need to understand that budgets are a constitutional function that every government in Canada, provincial or federal, needs to engage with. So they are looking at what is going to be happening in the next fiscal year. So that runs from April 1st to March 31st. Budget is both a constitutional requirement and a financial requirement as much as it is a political communications moment, though. And so when we look at what we're seeing in budget, we have to always look at it of, okay, we're getting the facts of what we need to see, but we're also hearing what we want the government to hear from us in terms of how we talk about it. So that's the lens through which we should look through this. When we are looking at budgets, we're seeing allocation of government funding, as well as context on economic and fiscal positions, which can help inform how we think the Alberta economy and the Canadian economy is going to be doing now and into the future. We also see new policies and political decisions and preferences. And when people read the budget of the current year, so that came out on February 27th, as a GR and public policy professional, I'm always encouraging folks to begin planning for next budget, so Budget 2026, right now. And we have several resources on our platform that can help you do that. So important to understand that we're looking at what's happened next year with some reflection on what we think is going to happen by the end of the fiscal year on March 31st, 2025. And we are discerning between the facts as well as the nuance and marketing that government provides for government budgets. A few terminology that you should be aware of when we look at assumptions. These are things that the government's using to inform on economic conditions or revenues. When you look at budget, that's what has been approved in previous budgets. Actuals are what actually happened when a fiscal year ended, so might be different than what was budgeted. Forecast is an estimate based on current data on what's likely to happen with either revenues or expenditures. Estimates are what we're looking at when we look at the budget 2025 today. So we're looking at what the government estimates it's going to spend next fiscal year. And then targets are often noted as revenue or expense targets for future years. So important to really understand this terminology. Make sure that when you look at budget, you're looking at the right year. So if you're looking at 24-25, that's last fiscal. If you want to look at this next fiscal, beginning on April 1st, 2025, you need to be looking at numbers that are 2025 to 2026. As well, want to make sure that you're aware of several different elements of budget, which is going to be important for you if you're looking for information. The fiscal plan is the document that everyone usually gravitates to. It's the one that is, usually 80 to 100 pages that includes a bunch of information. But make sure that you're also looking at the Government of Alberta strategic plan, as well as individual ministry business plans. You're going to get a lot of information on, beyond the numbers, what their strategic goals are. So if you are doing government relations and public policy work, it's not enough to just know what they're spending. It needs to, you need to also pay attention to what their priorities are. And then the estimates documents are very important. These are the actual voted on supply documents. So this is the legislative branch giving the executive branch, the government of Alberta, permission to spend in these areas after they vote. And just to draw your attention to government estimates. So government estimates are going to begin on Monday, March 10th. So this upcoming Monday. This is a very important arena for you to be in if you are very affected by government budgets. This is an opportunity for ministers to go to relevant committees to discuss and debate what has actually been included in budget. So this is really a beyond the headlines opportunity to get into what is going to be happening. And it's a process that's part of our constitution that takes place to ensure transparency and accountability before MLAs and the legislature actually vote on the Appropriations Act. So that's just a key overview of what you need to know for budgets. Let's dive into what is actually happening in Budget 2025 in Alberta, tabled last week. So I want to draw your attention to a few things. Before we dive into the numbers, let's look at the framework that we are analyzing budget in. So Alberta has a fiscal framework that was introduced a couple of years ago that provides guardrails of what the government is and is not able to do. So these guardrails include the principles of balanced budgets, limits to year-over-year operating increases to no more than population growth and or inflation, as well as very specific rules on where surplus cash can be allocated. So in this year's budget, we actually see the government break its fiscal framework on balanced budgets, which it is able to do in certain circumstances with a $5.2 billion deficit projected. This is in response to challenging economic circumstances, which we'll get into talking about a bit more later. In terms of year-over-year spending increases, many people believe that the government's fiscal framework allows them to increase operational spending to both population growth and inflation, which are respectively 2.5 and 2.6% for next year. That is not the case. This is a ceiling, that addition of those two metrics, and not a minimum. So we do see that the government is increasing spending overall by 3.6%, and they're allocating $4 billion to contingency funding, which is required if they don't think that they have enough information to allocate funding appropriately, because they are not, under the fiscal framework, able to do in-year spending increases unless it has been pre-approved in this contingency. So a bit of a higher number on that contingency fund than we typically see at $2 billion, because there's lots of uncertainty in budget, which we're going to get into talking about. And there's no need to discuss the allocation of surplus cash because there is not a surplus projected. However, if the government did finish this fiscal year and had a surplus, there are very specific ways in which it can allocate it, which is not to increase spending or, give everybody a raise across government ministries. It is to pay down debt, invest in the Heritage Savings Trust Fund, or put into the Alberta Fund, which is a fund that's set aside for one-time spending on specific initiatives. So very important to understand that the government has actually limited its ability to increase spending pretty significantly with this fiscal framework, though as we're going to see, it's not as though it can't expand that. So in today's webinar here, we're talking about the key priorities for Budget 2025. So this year, we are talking about maintaining Alberta's advantage as well as supporting Albertans. So these are the key priorities that government says it has developed budget. So making sure that Albertans continue to experience a low tax environment with affordable cost of living, but also making some pretty significant investments into healthcare and education without any top line spending cuts to main ministries. We'll talk a little bit more. There was not a single cut to a ministry that provides significant public services. The only two ministries that were cut in this budget were Service Alberta and Red Tape Reduction and Tourism and Sport. Every single other ministry received an increase The government also titles its budget this year as Meeting the Challenge. Now, what do those challenges include? The government is telling us that they see the following 7 things as challenges that are going to make it difficult for them to balance the budget this year, sort of justifying why there's a projected deficit. So they're citing federal policies, so whether that is emissions caps or other policies that relate to the energy sector, these are policies that the government of Alberta believes are limiting growth and therefore putting us in a precarious financial situation for this year. We also see cost of living as being a challenge. So Albertans facing increased cost of living due to inflation, which is lower this year, but has been higher in previous years due to COVID and inflation. Extreme population growth. This year, population growth not as high as in previous years, but this challenge of meeting the service delivery demands of a growing population, something that the government sees as a challenge in terms of maintaining that Alberta advantage as part of their strategic plan. The government is also in the middle of several different contract negotiations with public sector employees. Many of those collective bargaining agreements were up in the recent year. And so those contract negotiations are ongoing. And so in order to avoid strikes or prolonged and protracted disagreements between the unions with which the government is bargaining with and their members, the government is looking at this as a challenge as well. More people, more service delivery, increased demands from unions on public sector contract negotiations. So a big barrier for them in terms of balancing, as well as climate change. So we've seen extreme weather events due to floods, fire, hail in the province. And so meeting the public service and public infrastructure demands that come with these challenges of climate change, very important for this government, as well as the cost of borrowing. So we've seen interest rates, come down a bit from where they've been. But again, Alberta does still carry a pretty significant debt load, And so meeting those borrowing costs and as well as the maturing debt that's coming up for Alberta is something that is impacting this budget, as well as geopolitical uncertainty. I bolded that one because that's perhaps one of the biggest question marks we saw all week, back and forth on tariffs, extreme uncertainty in the form of what tariffs, if and when they stay around for a long time, how reciprocal tariffs are going to impact cost of living, how this is going to affect revenues, how this is going to affect unemployment and overall economic performance. This is a huge challenge that the government is acknowledging it needs to deal with. So those are the challenges the government says that it's facing. But of course, we are going to unpack some of the unspoken context that is probably weighing on the government's mind as well. We look at internal political dynamics. There's been some significant sort of disagreements, if you will, within caucus. Pete Guthrie, Alberta's former Minister of Infrastructure, stepped down earlier last week before budget. We have different MLAs coming out with criticisms of the government due to political issues. And so some of these things are also going to be weighing on the government because it is a political consideration as much as it is a fiscal consideration. We are also looking at the different, polling numbers and like what the public is going to think about the government and what they've done. We've got a lot of different elections coming up. We've got a federal election coming up, perhaps as early as April, but definitely by October. There's going to be a new prime minister after Sunday, after the Liberal leadership race concludes. We have municipal elections coming up in October. So again, what are the election timing of elections happening surrounding Alberta, but also what is the runway that Alberta has until its next election? Alberta's next provincial election is going to be in the fall of 2027. So we're at about that halfway mark. And so how is the government going to shift its strategy in this budget and future budgets in terms of how it speaks to Albertans and sort of markets itself? Because make no mistake, the campaign for a provincial election begins about a year and a half before the actual vote. And so that's coming up within the next 6 to 12 months for sure. So when we get into talking about the specifics of the numbers of budget 2025, let's look at how it started and how it's going. So from a top line measurement perspective, the top boxes you're looking at are the 24-25 forecast. These aren't the numbers that were included in budget 2024. These are the numbers that are included as part of budget 2025 now that we've been almost all the way through that fiscal year. So we'll get final numbers on these in future economic updates, but that is sort of where we're comparing to last year. And then bottom numbers are what they're forecasting or estimating for this year. So a few things. We see that revenue is projected to go down in this year from what we believe is going to be collected at the end of last year, which actually ends on March 31st of this year. We see revenues down pretty significantly due to some of the geopolitical uncertainty, oil price revenues, et cetera, that we are going to get into chatting about. We also see operating expense has increased. So despite the revenue going down and Alberta having a deficit, we see spending still increase. So that is sort of something that we're going to get into too in terms of what that decision looks like. That's not operational. They've also increased spending in the capital plan envelope for 25 to 28, so over 3 years. So an extra almost $4.2 billion in that envelope. We also see an increase in contingency funding because the government needs to have some room to deal with tariffs, natural disasters, as well as collective bargaining agreements that may not be the data for which may not be available. And they're not actually allowed, as I mentioned earlier, to make those in-year increases. They have to vote on a contingency at the outset in order to be able to spend that money. And so you see they've done that there. $5.2 billion deficit this year. Big change from the surplus that we saw last year at $5.8 billion. We saw some of that surplus cash from last year allocated to debt repayment as well as Heritage Savings Trust Fund. So big swing in revenues there just due to that political uncertainty and those revenue uncertainties and that increases in operating spending. And then as well, we see the debt increase slightly, but nothing to be too concerned about. When we look at economic assumptions, so we are seeing a decrease in real GDP growth here. So last year we saw GDP growth at 3%. This year we're projecting 1.8%, or the government is projecting rather. Again, geopolitical uncertainty, what's going to happen with tariffs, how are jobs going to be impacted? And it looks like jobs are going to be impacted because they are projecting a higher unemployment rate at 7.4%. So this is something that, again, it hasn't happened yet. They're looking at what's going to happen or what they predict is going to happen, as well as inflation coming down slightly, but still sort of elevated from historical lows that we may have seen previously, just due to the fact that prices are still high. Population growth also slightly lower than we've seen last year, but still decently high. Alberta is going to be a growing province and be reaching over 5 million individuals pretty soon. Energy assumptions, lower WTI oil, again, we're collecting that revenue in USD, and the impact of tariffs is making it difficult to assume that we're going to have higher revenues because of what tariffs are going to likely do, broadly speaking, to the Canada-US dollar, but also to the price of oil itself. And so you see that differential is going up, which has a really big impact in Alberta. $1 revenue swings for Alberta, $1 price of oil swings for Alberta can have as much as a $750 million impact on Alberta's bottom line. So the fact that we're projecting $6 per barrel lower over the average is billions of dollars of impact to Alberta's bottom line potentially. And we see that reflected as well in the exchange rate too. When we look at broader revenue spend in this budget, so we are seeing revenues about $6.6 billion or 8% lower than we are going to see at the end of 24-25. So where are those revenues going? Like, why are we having lower revenues? There's a few reasons. We're seeing an over $4 billion decline in non-renewable resource revenue, which has a pretty significant impact to Alberta's bottom line, as well as that roller coaster. We're seeing $600 million less projected in corporate income tax revenue. Again, geopolitical uncertainty. I'm going to repeat myself a ton here. The idea that Alberta's economy is going to be struggling because of those tariffs and uncertainty. We're also seeing $1.2 billion less in personal income tax revenue collected because of the tax break that Alberta provided in this budget, which we'll get into talking to. We're also seeing lower investment income and revenue from government business enterprises as well. So you're seeing a lower revenue coming in. Over time, we're sort of seeing how that oil price or oil price variation and that roller coaster. You could put a little roller coaster on this if you wanted to, the ups and downs that we see. So definitely worse than last year, but not the worst that we've seen in the past decade. When we look at expenses, we are seeing expenditures increase about 4.4 billion or 6% more than in 24-25. So we are seeing an increase in expenses because Alberta has made some pretty historic increases to health and education, for example, combined about $3 billion. They've also increased the capital plan for the next fiscal year by about almost $1 billion. And then they've also put aside that extra $2 billion, total of $4 billion for contingency. So there's where some of the extra expenses and increases are coming from. Again, I mentioned every single ministry other than Tourism and Sport and Service Alberta and Red Tape Reduction, as well as the Legislative Assembly, received increases. So every ministry that provides a lot of those social services is receiving those increases. Now, you have to ask yourself, that ministry can allocate and spend that money any way they like within their ministry. So just because there's top line increases doesn't mean that there are increases to whatever program matters to you, which is why I mentioned estimates and the importance of following along that over time. Again, you can see Alberta's debt increased significantly over the past 10 years, but it is going down directionally because of the way that Alberta has been allocating extra money from surpluses to pay down debt. Also, where Alberta is allocating surpluses is to the Heritage Savings Trust Fund. So they've made this a huge key priority. They have established back in January what they're calling a Heritage Fund Opportunities Corporation to manage how this fund is going to be grown to about $250 billion by 2050. That's their target. By the end of next fiscal year, so March 31st, 2026, there will be almost $25 billion. So pretty significant growth aspirations for the Heritage Saving Trust Fund, but some of what they've included in the fiscal framework empowers them to be able to do this. So again, investments in this fund, not using any of the investment income for operations, retaining that funding and putting surplus funds in there is going to be the path to how they get there. Let's look at just what's new and notable in budget. Now, I don't mean to be sort of bleak, but this budget wasn't a budget where, our team went through it and was like, oh my goodness, there's so many new things in here. There wasn't. I'm not saying there wasn't a lot included, but there weren't these like sweeping changes to programs and taxes that we may have seen passed. So let's look at what is new and notable. So the biggest thing that we saw out of budget 2025 is the UCP's commitment to this personal income tax break, taking the income earned, introducing a new tax bracket for income earned under $60,000 to 8% from 10%. Alberta does not have a flat tax. It has a progressive tax system. So this is going to save individuals about $750 per year. Two-parent income families, about $1,500 per year. So that was the big one. This is happening 2 years ahead of schedule. Originally, the UCP was going to introduce this over a couple of years and actually alluded earlier this year that they might not be able to do it because of the fiscal situation, but they've gone ahead and done it because of the geopolitical uncertainty and the affordability crisis that is ongoing in Alberta. So that's the reason that they've said they're doing it again. We said earlier, this is about a $1.2 billion per year cost. And it is a tax break that will impact everybody. And because Alberta has a progressive tax system, it's not like this is benefiting somebody who makes $200,000 a year more than somebody who makes $80,000 a year because of the progressive tax system. As well, what we see is an increase to the education property tax rate. So this is a provincial tax that is collected by municipalities. We see this go up after it has not gone up for a couple of years. This is going to increase the total amount of education system funding that is gleaned from this tax to about 31% from about 29%. So this is a tax that's collected by municipalities, but is a provincial tax. People in Edmonton will end up paying on a $700,000 home about $100 more per year. People in Calgary about $230 more per year. So again, this is a tax increase that is going to impact individuals charged, basically rendered on your municipal tax bill, but it is a government tax, so it goes towards paying for education. There have also been several different fee increases that the government has introduced. So tiny increases in some cases, big increases in others. So these are all the different things. So, things that you would pay for at the registry, immigration fees, those kinds of things, lots of increases there that you may or may not notice depending on how you access those fees. And then they've also allocated more than what they normally do for contingency funding because of all the uncertainty that we discussed. So those are the key notable things that are we're looking at in budget. I mean, I did a sort of Martha and Henry household impact. Martha and Henry, as many of you know, is what many people kind of refer to as the traditional family. I don't want to be specific in this, but this is what we're seeing in terms of what the net impact of budget 2025 is probably going to be for a lot of families. So you'll see a decrease in personal income taxes paid, $750 to $1,500, depending on per year, depending on who you are. But then you are going to see probably higher property tax increases, higher government fees. And then, this doesn't really impact individuals as much, but the fuel tax on locomotive fuels increasing as well. So if there's, trickle impacts on that, we can sort of see that in the economy. So that's sort of the net impact that we're seeing on budget for individuals. We don't have all the information yet, though, on what's going to sort of be new and notable in terms of budget, because we don't have, as I said, complete information. So what I'm keeping an eye on in terms of how budget 2025 is going to impact individuals and families, we still have several contract negotiations ongoing with respect to public sector bargaining discussions. So let's see how those go. How are teachers, nurses, educational assistants, et cetera, going to finally land on their contracts with the Government of Alberta? So if you are in those sectors, you may see changes to your compensation, increases as maybe as not as much as you thought, or otherwise. So keep an eye on that. Also, we haven't actually seen the immediate impacts of unemployment rate changes. So people, if the tariffs continue to impact jobs and economic growth, we could see unemployment start to increase, which the government is projecting it will increase to 7.4% from 7%. We also can see greater inflation because tariffs do have an inflationary impact. So we could see prices increase on food, on things that we get from the United States. Those are some things that we are watching as well. And then in terms of AISH benefits, they are introducing a new program for the assured income for the severely handicapped, known as AISH. That program is going to roll out in 2026. It will be a change in benefit for many people. They are saying it's not going to be a decrease in benefit, but again, we don't know what that program change is going to look like, so we'll watch for that in following budgets. When we look at the cause and effect of tariffs, I want to just spend a couple of slides talking about this. So here's really the impact of tariffs. When the United States puts a tariff on Canadian imports to the United States, we're seeing that import having an impact in both Canada and the United States. And so this cycle that we're in of retaliatory tariffs is going to have an impact on cost of living and how much things cost. And so it is yet to be seen whether or not political pressure from the United States and how this is going to increase costs for Americans is going to put pressure. It's yet to be seen. I have Justin Trudeau here as our prime minister, but we are going to have a different prime minister next week because the Liberal leadership race is happening on Sunday, and a new prime minister will be sworn in next week. And we could honestly be in an election pretty soon. So we don't know exactly who's going to be the face of dealing with Trump as of next week, but likely it's Carney. It could be somebody different in a couple of months, depending on the election. And just to underscore how big of an impact tariffs have on the Canadian economy, the reason why this is such a big deal for Canada, it's a big deal for the United States as well, but our economy is highly dependent upon exports to the United States and exports generally. We really depend on that US demand. And we also import a higher percentage of our consumer goods. So things that you're buying in the stores, whereas some countries like the United States may have better domestic supply chains to meet those demand for consumer goods, Canada is not that way. Canada also has a significantly smaller economy than the United States does by about $24 trillion. And so shocks are going to impact us more. As well, the US dollar is a global reserve currency, so we are going to be susceptible, especially with oil prices, to how tariffs are going to impact the exchange rate and the US dollar and Canadian dollar rather relative to the US dollar. So these are the impacts of tariffs that we're paying a lot of attention to. We do have resources on the platform for you on this if you're interested in diving in. So as we sort of bring our discussion here to the what does it mean, meat and potatoes part of what we're talking about, let's just dive in. So we can look at all of the facts that happened in budget, but I like to look beyond the facts. What are the facts telling us about what the government thinks about its fiscal situation, as well as what we are likely to expect in the future? And so this is really about the anticipating and interpreting political risk part of what we do. So what does it mean? My interpretation of Budget 25 for Alberta is that they want to be seen as over-delivering and under-promising. So essentially what they wanted to do, I think, with this budget is they really wanted to paint a very bleak economic picture. They're not unfounded in having that perspective, but the bleaker economic picture that they paint, the bigger deficit that they project, remember, budgets are a projection. When we're talking about Budget 2025, we're talking about what we think is going to happen next year. So by them structuring the budget as being dire straits and having this deficit, that might not actually be the case by the end of the fiscal year. Say the tariffs only last a couple of months. Say any other number of things happen. Say there's a new federal government that's more Alberta friendly. Say any of these things happen. We could have an economic situation that's fundamentally different by the end of this fiscal year on March 31st, 2026 than we are projecting now. So I see the province as projecting bad outcomes. And so within the context of not being too doom and gloom, but just really putting an emphasis on the fact it's not going to be an easy fiscal situation so that they can then come back and hopefully it's not as bad as it was. Hopefully the deficit's not as big. Hopefully they didn't need to spend as much as that contingency funding. And it is possible that they actually do end the year on a surplus, even though they're projecting a deficit. Not saying that's likely, but that's really how they're trying to frame the situation. The tariffs are having a big impact. The federal government's having a big impact. All of these different external factors that they don't themselves control having an impact, and hoping that it's actually better than what they've projected. So that's number one. Number two, in budgets are as much an economic document as they are a political document, as I said, and we are just about passing that 2-year mark of this government with the next provincial election happening in late 2027. But the problem with having to make everybody happy is that you end up really making nobody happy. I'm not saying that's what's happened here in Budget 25. Actually, the response on Budget 2025 has been pretty positive from municipalities generally, from post-secondary institutions, et cetera. Like, nobody can really point to huge cuts. And so the government has actually done a pretty good job at sort of making sure that the traditional stakeholders that may be upset with budget don't have too much to grab onto. However, that creates some problems for people who are real fiscal small c conservatives, which we'll talk about in a couple of minutes here, because you can argue if the government is projecting a deficit that they shouldn't have made increases, or shouldn't have spent money on certain capital projects, or shouldn't have moved ahead rather with the tax cut. And so they, I think, from a political perspective on budget, have done a pretty good job at not making too many people unhappy. But again, if you don't like deficits or you think there should have been higher increases, it's hard to make everybody happy. The reason why this is relevant is because the UCP doesn't have this massive majority in the Legislative Assembly of Alberta right now. There are 87 seats in the legislature, and they have just 11 seats lead, soon to be 10, because when the Edmonton-Strathcona by-election happens by June 30th, Naheed Nenshi will win in that seat. That is a safe NDP seat, and they'll have a 10-seat margin over the NDP. And what do they do about the internal conflicts? What do they do about, Pete Guthrie and Scott Sinclair and some of the other individuals within caucus who are not happy with the government for one reason or another? So again, they have to make the external happy, but they also have to make the internal happy because they don't have these huge seat margins. Do I see a situation where the government falls before November of 2027 and then in the next October, rather, in the next provincial election? No, but I'm just saying that it is a risk. It's not a 30-seat lead. It's a narrow lead in the legislature, so they have to be considerate of that. We also have to look at the Trump exposure. So for Alberta, it's not insignificant. So what is the balance for the government of not being so aggressive that we don't see an end to these tariffs sooner than we'd like to, but also recognizing that a lot of our economic security is tied up in our relationship with the United States? And what if we don't have a federal government that's advocating for Alberta in the way that we want to? So the exposure for Alberta is significant. It's significant across Canada for sure, but because we don't have, from a revenue perspective, on a PST or other export markets rather super developed, this is going to be significant for us. So Alberta has to really balance that. How do we be part of Team Canada, but understand that this is a really big deal for us on oil and gas, particularly it comes to exports. One other thing that I like to sort of raise here. So you see the NDP in their opposition role from a communications perspective, trying to frame their criticism of Budget 2025 from an ethics versus economy perspective, which I'm saying. The NDP, in criticizing Budget 2025, has done so by criticizing the fact that Alberta has a deficit to try and sort of gain points on their fiscal capabilities and marketing themselves as really a prudent NDP party versus a high spend party that doesn't care about deficits. And so in doing that, in their criticism, they have criticized the deficit, but they've also criticized that there aren't significant spending increases, and they've also tried to tie budget to some of the things that are happening politically and from an ethics perspective with respect to the AHS situation. So this is a very interesting frame for the NDP, but I don't know that it's going to have the impact that they want to from a communications perspective, because as much as people do care about ethics, and I'm not trying to say that they don't, when the economy is threatened, there is this higher order occupation sometimes with how the economy is going to be impacted. So I haven't seen that argument land probably to the extent that they had hoped it would on the NDP side. So again, that opposition back and forth. And again, we don't see Naheed Nenshi, who is the leader of the NDP, sitting in the legislature right now. He doesn't have a seat. The premier has until the end of June to call a by-election in that seat. And you better believe that they're going to be waiting till the last minute to do so, because there's no reason for them to have to be giving Naheed Nenshi that opportunity to sit in the legislature. So it's not actually the leader of the NDP, the person who would become premier after the next provincial election, that is sitting there and representing the party in the legislature. So this is a different challenge that they have as well. Brings us to the question of, is the UCP and is Alberta conservatism conservative in name only? We see spending increases, we see deficits. Is this congruent with what people sort of have an idea of the UCP being? So again, I would argue that it is probably not prudent to not increase spending when you have population growth and significant risks on affordability. But again, if you want it to be a pure conservative and criticize the budget, you may say that they should have held back spending increases, not done some of the announcements that they've made. But again, a government can't be an ethical purist, an ideological purist on every issue when you're dealing with real world circumstances. So from my perspective, by making not everybody happy, they've sort of hit a tone that allows them to sort of navigate both the fiscal prudence as well as supporting Albertans side of things, which is what they wanted to do. So I think from that perspective, they didn't make too many mistakes here from a political and comms perspective. And then again, last thing, who's the enemy in Ottawa? So Alberta and the UCP, and actually the NDP too under Notley, has a lot of political hay and benefit from criticizing Ottawa. But we're going to see a new prime minister after Sunday's Liberal leadership race. we are going to see an election in the next 6 months, timing to be determined. And so how will Alberta structure its relationship and communications to the about the federal government in a way that still makes people want to continue to support the UCP government, right? So we see that political consideration and challenge. So I anticipate that, in the coming months and weeks, we will start to see a bit of a shift in, if there's a new Conservative government in Ottawa, for example, the province is not going to be able to use the same argument it has on Ottawa as the source of all of our issues. So Alberta will probably have to, look in the mirror on that. To sort of move forward, because there's not going to be that kind of opportunity for interjurisdictional tension like there is today. So those are the things that I think that you should be thinking about and what budget actually means. And you can overlay that to your organization based on whatever issue you're looking at. And certainly you're able to reach out to us with any questions if you have them. So in terms of staying informed on budget now and into the future, you can always follow us on social media. We do have a free newsletter that's sent every Friday, summarizes everything that you really need to know about what's happening in Alberta. We have a subscription-based membership where you can access our live budget briefing note and trackers so that you have the materials that you need, as well as templates for next budget. And then we do have our next session of the RGR 101 cohort beginning on April 24th. We have early bird pricing on our GR 101 cohort until March 15th for $500 off. So if you want to snag your spot at a discounted price, we encourage you to do that. But yeah, we'll be posting a lot more on social media and discussing these issues in depth. So if you have any questions, please do reach out to us at hello@pocketlobbyist.com. We hope that you enjoyed and found some of these insights beneficial. And if you have any specific questions about Budget 2025, feel free to reach out to us. Thanks so much for being here today, and we hope to see you soon. Happy budget, everybody.